Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the Banco Central robbery in Fortaleza, Brazil. It is August, the year 2005. The city of Fortaleza sits on the northeastern coast, where the Atlantic breeze usually carries the scent of salt and the warmth of the tropical sun. But on the morning of Monday, August 8th, the air inside the massive concrete walls of the central bank felt different. It was heavy. It was still. Imagine the city waking up. The palm trees swaying gently along the beach, the first few buses rumbling through the streets, and the sun beginning to bake the pavement of Dom Manuel Avenue. For the employees of the Banco Central, it was just the start of another week. A routine Monday. They could not have known that beneath their feet, the very ground had been hollowed out, and the wealth they were sworn to protect had vanished like a ghost into the earth. As the clock ticked toward 8 in the morning, the staff began to arrive. There is a specific sound to a bank of this magnitude: the heavy thrum of the industrial air conditioning, the echoing click of leather shoes on polished marble floors, and the soft murmur of greetings. The Banco Central do Brasil is a fortress of finance. It is not a place where one expects surprises. The walls are thick, the security is layered, and the vault, the heart of the building, is a sanctuary of steel and reinforced concrete. On this particular Monday, the guards moved through their checklists with practiced ease. They swiped cards, turned keys, and bypassed the electronic locks that had remained silent all weekend. There had been no alarms. No sensors had tripped. The silent guardians of the bank had seen nothing, heard nothing, and reported nothing. The vault door itself is a marvel of engineering. It weighs several tons, a massive disc of metal that requires precision and authority to open. As the heavy bolts retracted with a deep, metallic thud, the staff prepared for the familiar sight of the weekend's holdings. In this vault, the bank kept massive quantities of used 50-real notes, currency that was destined to be sorted or withdrawn from circulation. Because these notes were used, their serial numbers were not recorded in a sequence, making them nearly impossible to track. To a thief, they were the perfect prize. But as the heavy door swung wide, the expected sight of stacked crates and organized wealth was replaced by a staggering, impossible void. The room was not as they had left it on Friday afternoon. The silence that followed was not the peaceful quiet of a secure room, but the deafening silence of a crime so bold it defied immediate comprehension. The first thing they noticed was the space. The vault, which should have been crowded with the weight of millions, felt hollow. Then their eyes fell to the floor. There, in the center of the reinforced concrete, was a perfect circular hole. It was about 70 centimeters in diameter, a dark mouth leading down into the unknown. The floor of this vault was over 1 meter thick, solid concrete reinforced with iron bars, yet it had been pierced as if it were nothing more than cardboard. Strewn around the hole were the remnants of the intruder's stay. There were empty cans of energy drinks and discarded juice boxes, the mundane trash of men who had worked for hours in the dark. A fine layer of white powder, possibly lime or chalk, had been scattered across the floor. A final, clever attempt to mask any fingerprints or footprints left behind in the rush. The realization began to sink in with a cold, creeping dread. This was not a simple break-in. This was a surgical strike. The thieves had not just entered the vault, they had emerged from the earth itself. As the managers and security officials stood frozen, the magnitude of the loss started to take shape. They began to realize that over 3.5 tons of paper currency were gone. 164 million reais. Translated at the time, that was roughly $70 million. It was a sum so large that it was difficult to visualize. If you were to stack those 50-real notes one on top of the other, the pile would reach over 30 meters into the sky. And yet, there was no sign of the money, no sign of the men, and no sign of how they had moved such a monumental weight through a hole in the floor without a single person in the city of Fortaleza noticing. The Monday morning silence stretched on, broken only by the frantic calls to the federal police. Outside, the city continued its business, unaware that the largest bank robbery in the history of Brazil had just been discovered. The workers looked down into that dark hole, smelling the damp scent of earth and the faint metallic tang of the tools used to cut the steel. They were looking at the end of a tunnel that stretched 80 meters out into the neighborhood, passing under busy streets and deep beneath the foundations of other buildings. In those first moments of discovery, the mystery was absolute. Who were these people? How long had they been beneath the floor? And where, in the vast sprawl of Brazil, could 3.5 tons of cash simply disappear? The shadows of Fortaleza had kept their secret all weekend. But now, as the sun rose higher, the hunt was beginning. To understand the silence that followed that Monday morning, we must first look at the noise that preceded it. Not the noise of a break-in, but the quiet, rhythmic hum of a city at work. In the early months of 2005, the air in Fortaleza was thick with its usual seaside humidity, a heavy warmth that clings to the skin like a damp veil. On a street called Rua 25 de Março, just a single block away from the towering, fortress-like walls of the central bank, a new rhythm was beginning to take shape. It started with a lease, a simple transaction for a modest house at number 1071. From the outside, it was just another building in the neighborhood, but within its walls, a masterpiece of deception was being cultivated. Imagine the scene. The sun is high, casting long, sharp shadows across the pavement, and a group of men arrives not with weapons, but with clipboards and a vision for a garden. The house was painted a vibrant, welcoming shade of green. Soon, a sign appeared over the doorway, announcing the arrival of a new business, Grama Synthetica, synthetic grass. It was a brilliant choice for a front, a name that evoked images of manicured lawns and the clean, plastic scent of artificial turf. To the neighbors, these were simply entrepreneurs, hardworking men looking to capitalize on the city's desire for evergreen beauty in a tropical climate. They were professional, polite, and remarkably thorough. They wore matching overalls emblazoned with the company logo, a small detail that acted as a psychological shield. Who would suspect a man in a uniform? They even went so far as to hand out flyers and business cards, offering their services to the surrounding homes. They were building a reputation, a layer of social armor that would hide the frantic industry happening just beneath their floorboards. Inside the house, the atmosphere was vastly different. While the front rooms were staged with rolls of bright green turf and samples of landscaping materials, the back room was the mouth of a different world. Here, the charming facade ended. In the center of a rear bedroom, the floor had been meticulously cut away, revealing the dark, cool earth of Fortaleza. This was the starting point of a journey that would span 80 meters. The air inside the house began to smell less like plastic grass and more like deep, damp clay. The men weren't just salesmen, they were engineers of the shadows. They worked in shifts, around the clock, their movements a choreographed dance of excavation. They used GPS equipment to ensure their heading was true, a digital compass guiding them through the blind dark toward the vault. Every inch forward was a triumph of patience over the stifling heat that pooled in the corners of the rooms. As the weeks turned into months, a significant problem arose: the earth itself. Digging a tunnel 4 meters below the surface is not merely a matter of moving dirt. It is a matter of vanishing it. They were excavating a passage 70 centimeters wide, reinforced with wood and lined with plastic to prevent the sandy soil from collapsing. This process generated an immense volume of debris, approximately 30 tons of earth. In any other circumstance, 30 tons of dirt leaving a residential house would have brought the police to the door within hours. But here, the cover story of the artificial grass company became their greatest weapon. Neighbors watched as a white van, also branded with the Grama Synthetica logo, backed into the garage day after day. They saw workers loading heavy, bulging sacks into the back. They assumed these were supplies, soil, natural turf, or perhaps the heavy rubber backing used for synthetic lawns. The thieves were hiding the evidence of their crime in plain sight, masquerading as the very product they claimed to sell. The tunnel was a marvel of illicit architecture. It wasn't just a hole in the ground, it was a lifeline. They installed electric lighting that cast a dim, amber glow along the wooden supports, making the narrow passage feel like the ribs of a great, subterranean beast. They even rigged a ventilation system, using a tube connected to an air conditioning unit to pump fresh air into the depths. This was necessary because, at 4 meters down, the air grows thin and heavy with the smell of sweat and ancient soil. Can you hear the sound of the shovels? A soft, repetitive thud against the earth, followed by the scrape of metal on stone. It was a rhythmic, meditative sound, masked by the ambient noise of the city streets above. Pedestrians walked just feet above their heads, catching buses and laughing with friends, never realizing that a small army was burrowing toward the heart of the nation's wealth. To further the illusion, the gang engaged in a form of neighborhood theater. They were friendly. They occasionally gave away samples of their grass, small mats of green that neighbors placed on their porches. This generosity created a sense of community trust. When the white van made its frequent trips, people simply waved. The thieves had mastered the art of being uninteresting. They were the background noise of the street, as predictable as the morning sun. Inside the house, they kept things remarkably clean. There were no piles of dirt in the hallways, no telltale dust on the windows. They used burnt lime and white powder to scrub away their own fingerprints and to keep the workspace manageable. They lived a double life. By day, the diligent landscapers of Grama Synthetica. By night, the architects of the century's most audacious heist. By the end of July, the tunnel was nearly complete. The 80-meter path now stretched beneath the busy asphalt of the street, past the foundations of neighboring buildings, and directly beneath the reinforced concrete floor of the bank's vault. The men could likely hear the muffled vibrations of the city traffic above them, a constant reminder of the world they were about to shock. They had spent 3 months living in the garden of artificial dreams, a world made of fake grass and very real ambition. They were standing at the threshold, just a few feet of steel-reinforced concrete away from their prize. The planning was over. The stage was set. In the quiet of the house on Rua 25 de Março, the landscapers put down their shovels and picked up their heavy-duty drills. The garden was ready for its harvest. The transition from the world above to the world below was marked by a heavy wooden trapdoor hidden beneath the floorboards of the bedroom. As the workers descended the ladder, the sounds of Fortaleza, the distant honk of horns, the rhythmic crashing of the Atlantic surf, and the chatter of the city began to dissolve into a thick, heavy silence. They were entering a space where time was measured not by clocks, but by the steady scrape of shovels against the earth. This was the beginning of the 80-meter journey, a narrow passage only 70 centimeters wide that cut through the deep, sandy soil of the city. To stand at the entrance was to look into a light at the end of a very long, very dark throat, a marvel of illicit engineering that demanded absolute focus and an iron will. Each meter gained was a victory over the crushing weight of the earth overhead. To prevent the sandy walls from collapsing, the crew implemented a rigorous structural system. They utilized approximately 900 wooden planks to line the ceiling and the sides, creating a sturdy box that felt more like a hallway than a burrow. To further shield themselves from the constant rain of fine dust, they lined the wood with thick sheets of plastic. This served a dual purpose. It kept the environment relatively clean for the expensive machinery they were using, and it provided a smooth surface that allowed them to slide heavy loads of soil back toward the house. In the dim glow of the tunnel, the plastic walls would catch the light, shimmering like the skin of some subterranean creature. It was a claustrophobic masterpiece, a confined world where the ceiling sat just inches above their heads as they worked on their hands and knees, centimeter by painstaking centimeter. Illumination was constant. They didn't rely on flickering flashlights or handheld lanterns. Instead, an intricate network of electric cables snaked along the tunnel floor, powering a series of bright, incandescent bulbs that hung from the wooden support beams. The light was harsh and unforgiving, casting long, dancing shadows that followed the men as they moved. Along with the light came the low, persistent hum of electricity, a sound that masked the more subtle noises of the earth shifting or the muffled vibration of the street 4 meters above. They also installed an intercom system, a clever alternative to cellular phones that might have been tracked or tapped. This allowed the diggers at the front to communicate with the lookouts in the house, ensuring that any sign of danger at the surface could be relayed instantly to the men working in the deep. The heat beneath the streets of Fortaleza was suffocating. At a depth of 4 meters, with several men working in a confined space, the temperature would often climb to unbearable levels. To combat this, the thieves installed a sophisticated ventilation system. They used flexible tubes connected to powerful industrial fans and a modified air conditioning unit located in the house above. This forced cool air into the very back of the tunnel, providing a desperate lifeline for the men at the digging face. You could hear the constant whirring of the fans, a mechanical heartbeat that circulated the stale, oxygen-depleted air. Despite this, the physical toll was immense. The workers would emerge from their shifts drenched in sweat, their skin stained with the dark earth. Investigators later found jars of burn ointments and tubes of soothing creams scattered in the house, evidence of the friction and the heat that punished the bodies of those who dared to dig this 80-meter path. While the men worked below, the logistical challenge of the project was managed with equal precision. Over the course of 3 months, they removed approximately 30 tons of soil. If a neighbor had seen even a fraction of that dirt, the plan would have collapsed instantly. To solve this, the thieves operated under the guise of their synthetic grass company, Grama Synthetica. They loaded the soil into white plastic bags, the kind used for fertilizer or garden mulch, and stacked them neatly in the back of the house or transported them away in a van bearing the company logo. To any observer, the movement of earth was simply a part of a flourishing landscaping business. Inside the house, they even used burnt lime to cover the smell of the damp earth and to help scrub away any forensic traces. It was a seamless operation, a marriage of physical labor and psychological deception that kept the secret buried deep beneath the bustling downtown streets. By the end of July in the year 2005, the tunnel had reached its full length. The 80 meters of determination now terminated directly beneath the regional vault of the Banco Central. The men at the front could no longer hear the muffled tires of cars above. Instead, they were met with the profound, heavy silence of the bank's massive concrete foundation. They had successfully navigated beneath a busy city boulevard and past the footings of surrounding buildings without a single person suspecting a thing. They were now standing in a small, reinforced chamber at the end of the line, looking up at 1.1 meters of steel-reinforced concrete. The engineering was done, the lighting was set, and the air was flowing. All that remained was to break through the final barrier and step into the treasure room that had lived in their dreams for months. The silence in the tunnel was now thick with anticipation, as the crew prepared their diamond-tipped drills for the final act. By the late afternoon of Friday, August 5, 2005, the city of Fortaleza began to surrender to the slow rhythm of the weekend. Above ground, the staff of the Banco Central branch tidied their desks, locked the heavy doors, and set the alarms, unaware that the ground beneath their feet was no longer solid earth. While the city prepared for the warmth of a Saturday morning, a group of men gathered in the back room of a small house disguised as a synthetic grass company. The 80-meter journey they had spent months carving through the dark, sandy soil was finally complete. They stood at the very end of that narrow, plywood-lined passage, staring up at a ceiling of gray stone. This was the final barrier, the only thing standing between them and a fortune that surpassed their wildest dreams. The air in the tunnel was thick, cooled only slightly by the hum of the makeshift air conditioning unit that had kept them alive during the long months of digging. The task ahead was Herculean. They weren't just facing Earth anymore. They were facing 1.1 meters of steel-reinforced concrete. This was the floor of the vault, designed to withstand tremors, explosions, and the most determined of thieves. To avoid detection by the bank's seismic sensors, they could not use heavy explosives. Instead, they relied on precision and patience. Throughout Friday night and into the early hours of Saturday, August 6th, the sound of diamond-tipped drills and hydraulic jacks echoed softly within the confined space of the tunnel. Each vibration was a risk, a heartbeat of potential discovery, but the men worked with the steady focus of surgeons. The friction of the drill bits against the thick concrete created a fine gray powder that coated their skin and filled their lungs, a ghost-like dust that seemed to swallow the dim yellow light of the electric bulbs strung along the tunnel walls. The breakthrough happened sometime on Saturday. A small, jagged hole finally pierced through the floor of the vault. As the first bit of light from the high, secure room above filtered down into the dark tunnel, a profound silence must have fallen over the group. They had arrived. One by one, the leanest members of the gang pulled themselves up through the narrow opening, emerging into the inner sanctum of the bank. The vault was a cathedral of currency. Stacked from floor to ceiling were thousands of plastic-wrapped bundles of 50 real notes. These were the bills they had specifically targeted, used currency that had been collected from the public, unnumbered and virtually untraceable, destined for incineration, but now destined for a very different fate. The sheer scale of the wealth was staggering, a sea of paper and ink that filled the room with a distinct, metallic scent. The heist now shifted from engineering to grueling physical labor. They had to move 3.5 tons of cash. Imagine the effort required to transport that much weight through a tunnel only 70 centimeters wide. The gang organized a human chain, a rhythmic and exhausting process of passing heavy bags from the vault down into the hole and along the 80-meter passage. They utilized small wooden carts on improvised rails, a system they had built to remove soil, now repurposed to carry a treasure. The sound of plastic bags sliding against the plywood floor of the tunnel became the soundtrack of their weekend. For hours on end, through the heat of Saturday and the quiet of Sunday, August 7th, the men worked in shifts. Their muscles ached, and the humidity made the air feel like liquid. Yet the sight of the dwindling stacks in the vault provided a relentless fuel for their movement. Outside, the neighborhood of Rua 25 de Marco remained perfectly oblivious. Neighbors saw nothing unusual about the green-fronted house of the synthetic grass company. Perhaps a white van was parked out front, but it was a common sight for a local business. Inside that house, however, the back room was filling with more money than any of those men had ever seen in their lives. Over 164 million reais were being funneled through the earth and into the waiting hands of the conspirators. They worked with a strange sense of calm, knowing that as long as they remained beneath the surface, they were invisible. They had disabled the motion sensors and circumvented the cameras, creating a blind spot in the heart of the financial system. They were ghosts in the machinery, moving a literal mountain of wealth while the rest of the world slept or walked the sun-drenched streets above. By the time Sunday night arrived, the vault was almost entirely empty, save for the hole in the floor and a few scattered cartons of fruit juice and energy drinks the thieves had consumed to maintain their strength. The final bags were pulled through the tunnel, and the passage was finally abandoned. The men didn't leave in a rush. They left with the cold precision of professionals. They loaded the cash into various vehicles, preparing for a fragmented escape that would see the money scattered across the vast geography of Brazil. When the bank staff returned on Monday morning, August 8th, they found a scene that defied logic. The vault doors were secure, the locks were untouched, but the money was gone. All that remained was a circular void in the concrete, a silent mouth that whispered the story of a weekend where the ground itself had conspired to steal the nation's wealth. The morning of Monday, August 8th, 2005, did not begin with a bang, but with a heavy, suffocating silence. Inside the vault of the central bank in Fortaleza, the air was still thick with the smell of old paper and the lingering grit of pulverized concrete. When the first employees arrived to open the heavy doors, they didn't see a crime scene, at least, not at first. Everything looked normal until their eyes drifted to the floor. There, amidst the stacks of currency, was a dark, jagged void where solid ground should have been. The realization rippled through the building like a cold front. Over 3.5 tons of cash were gone. 164 million reais had vanished into the earth. As the sun climbed higher over the city, the federal police were already swarming the building, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous space that had been hollowed out from beneath. Investigators knew they were racing against a clock that had already been ticking for over 48 hours. The robbers had a massive head start. A theft of this magnitude required more than just shovels and grit. It required a logistical miracle to move that much weight. While some agents descended into the dark, timber-lined tunnel to map the path to the house on 25th of March Street, others began a frantic search of the surface world. They looked for the one thing a thief cannot hide: the sudden, blinding flash of new wealth. In a city like Fortaleza, where the economy moved at a steady, predictable pace, a sudden surge of millions of reais was like a flare fired into a midnight sky. They started at the most obvious place for a newly minted millionaire to visit: the high-end car dealerships. The search brought them to a used car lot that sat under the bright, unrelenting sun of Syrah. The air there smelled of fresh wax and hot asphalt. Detectives began questioning managers, asking about any unusual transactions from the previous 24 hours. It didn't take long for a salesman's eyes to widen with a mix of fear and realization. He told them about a group of men who had arrived shortly after the heist would have been completed. They didn't look like typical collectors or business magnates. They were casual, perhaps even a bit hurried, but they possessed a confidence that only comes from having a bottomless well of resources. They weren't there to browse or to haggle over monthly payments. They were there to buy a fleet, and they were going to pay for it right then and there. The details of the purchase were staggering. The men had selected 11 different vehicles, ranging from sturdy transport trucks to smaller cars. When it came time to settle the bill, which totaled approximately 1 million reais, there were no bank transfers and no credit checks. Instead, the men produced heavy bags. Inside those bags were thousands upon thousands of 50 reais notes, the exact denomination that had been taken from the bank's vault. The bills were crisp, though some bore the faint scent of the tunnel's damp earth. The dealership staff, perhaps blinded by the sheer scale of the commission, had processed the sale. By the time the police arrived, the men were gone, and more importantly, the 11 vehicles they had purchased were already on the road, headed toward the southern borders of the state. The investigators realized they weren't just looking for getaway cars. They were looking for a mobile treasury. The group had purchased a car carrier, a massive double-decker trailer designed to transport multiple vehicles at once. This was a brilliant, if audacious, camouflage. A truck carrying a load of cars is a common sight on Brazilian highways, easily ignored by patrols and toll booth operators. They suspected that the stolen millions weren't just sitting in the trucks, but were tucked inside the very cars being carried. The hunt shifted to the open road. Alerts were flashed across the radio frequencies of the Federal Highway Police. Every car carrier leaving the region was now a target of intense scrutiny. The net was being cast hundreds of miles wide, stretching toward the states of Tocantins and Minas Gerais. The breakthrough came on a stretch of highway far from the coastal heat of Fortaleza. A car transporter matching the description from the dealership was spotted and pulled over by a team of vigilant officers. The driver, a man named Jose Charles Mores, appeared nervous as the officers began to inspect his cargo. They started with the vehicles strapped to the trailer. At first glance, they were just new cars, their paint gleaming under the roadside lights. But when the officers began to pry at the interior panels and check the spare tire compartments, the secrets spilled out. Tucked inside the bodywork of 3 of the cars were bundles of cash. They found 6 million reais hidden in the crevices of the machinery. It was the first physical evidence of the stolen hoard, a mountain of paper that proved the tunnel dwellers had successfully reached the surface and were now scattering like seeds in the wind. With the car transporter intercepted and the first suspects in custody, the investigation turned its full gaze back to the heart of the crime, the tunnel itself. The descent into the passage felt like stepping into a different world entirely. Beneath the floorboards of the fake landscaping business, a heavy wooden hatch opened into a darkness that smelled of wet clay, old timber, and the faint, chemical scent of plastic. As the forensic investigators lowered themselves down the ladder, the humid, salt-tinged heat of the Fortaleza streets began to fade, replaced by a cool, artificial draft that felt unnatural so far underground. This was the entrance to a subterranean masterpiece, a passage that stretched 80 meters through the earth, passing directly under the heavy traffic of a busy city boulevard. It was here that the breath of the underground truly began to reveal the secrets of the men who had spent 3 months carving a silent path toward a fortune. The tunnel was not the crude, jagged burrow one might expect from a common criminal enterprise. It was a marvel of illicit engineering that demanded the respect of the engineers who were later brought in to examine the site. The walls were meticulously lined with expensive plastic sheeting, a necessary shield to keep the fine, shifting sand of the Brazilian coast from collapsing inward and burying the workers alive. Stout wooden beams provided a rhythmic skeleton for the passage, supporting the immense weight of the city and its residents moving high above. Every few feet, electric light bulbs dangled from a long, winding wire, casting a low, amber glow across the floor. This was a workspace designed for efficiency and long hours of toil. There was even a makeshift ventilation system, with long plastic tubes snaking through the passage to pump in fresh air from a hidden air conditioning unit back at the house. Despite the group's extreme efforts to remain invisible, the criminals had left a trail in the shadows. Forensic technicians, dressed in protective white suits that stood out starkly against the dark soil, moved inch by inch through the narrow passage. They discovered that the thieves had been remarkably disciplined. They had scattered a fine white powder, likely burnt lime or chalk, over almost every surface of the tunnel to destroy any trace of their identity or DNA. However, in the dim, flickering light, a technician's eyes caught a small glint on a single light bulb that was slightly loose in its socket. On the smooth, curved glass of that one bulb, which had been overlooked by the man who installed it, was a clear, solitary fingerprint. It was a tiny mistake, a moment of human haste when a man had reached up to adjust the light, leaving behind the one thing that could connect a real name to this mechanical ghost. Near the end of the tunnel, just beneath the heavy foundations of the bank's vault, the investigators found the discarded tools of the trade. There were professional-grade electric saws fitted with diamond-tipped blades, designed to chew through the toughest materials known to man. There were powerful drills and blowtorches, the metal still carrying the faint scent of heat and friction. But it was the smaller, everyday items that truly told the human story of the dig. They found empty cans of energy drinks and cartons of fruit juice, scattered as if the workers had only just stepped away for a break. There were even tubes of ointment used to soothe the burning muscles of men who had hauled over 30 tons of earth out of this hole by hand. These objects painted a picture of sweat, exhaustion, and a terrifying level of commitment. The technical precision required to reach this specific point was nothing short of staggering. The tunnel had been navigated with a surgical accuracy that suggested the group had access to internal maps or the help of someone who understood the bank's internal geography perfectly. They had navigated the subterranean city with care, moving exactly 4 meters underground to avoid the heavy vibrations of the street traffic and the bank's sensitive seismic motion detectors. The thieves knew exactly where to stop their forward progress and begin their vertical climb. They had positioned their breach directly beneath the center of the vault, in the specific area where the used banknotes were stored before being removed from circulation. By the time they began their final ascent, they were already in a blind spot, hidden from the security cameras that were only recording images rather than transmitting them to a live guard. The final obstacle for the team had been a massive slab of steel-reinforced concrete, 1.1 meters thick. It was a formidable barrier designed to withstand almost any imaginable intrusion. Yet the thieves had cut through it with incredible patience, creating a circular opening that looked as if it had been made by a professional construction crew. As the investigators looked up through that hole into the empty vault above, they were confronted by the sheer scale of the void left behind. 3.5 tons of paper currency had been moved through this narrow, plastic-lined tube, passed hand to hand in the cool darkness of the earth. The forensic team stood in the silence of the tunnel, listening to the muffled, distant sounds of the city above, realizing that while the money had vanished into the air, the earth itself had kept a meticulous record of the heist in the year 2005. The transition from the subterranean chill of the tunnel to the blinding, white heat of the Fortaleza sun was a shock to the senses. For months, the gang had lived in the artificial glow of electric bulbs and the scent of damp earth, but now the mission had shifted. The gold-colored 50 real notes, nearly 3.5 tons of them, were no longer just a target. They were a heavy, physical burden that needed to disappear into the vastness of the Brazilian interior. As the dust settled over the house on Rua 25 de Março, the focus of the investigation turned toward the horizon. The thieves knew that the quietest way to move millions was to hide them in plain sight, blending into the heavy commerce that flows along the country's endless asphalt arteries. The first major crack in the gang's armor appeared not at the bank, but at a local car dealership. In the days following the heist, a man walked into a showroom and did something that would immediately catch the eye of the federal police. He purchased 11 brand new vehicles at once, paying the entire balance in cash. It was a move born of equal parts audacity and desperation. The thieves needed a fleet of cars, specifically to be loaded onto a car carrier truck, known in Brazil as a cegonha. These vehicles were meant to be the Trojan horses of the operation, their pristine metal frames hiding the musty, used currency that had been hauled up from the vault floor only 48 hours prior. The logistics of the concealment were as meticulous as the digging of the tunnel. In a secluded garage, the gang worked in a feverish silence, removing the tires from the new vehicles. They weren't just using the trunks or the spare tire compartments. Instead, they used specialized tools to debead the rubber from the rims of the tires that would actually touch the road. They stuffed the hollow interiors of the tires with vacuum-sealed bricks of cash. Imagine the sound of the rubber stretching, the thick, metallic scent of the brand new cars mixing with the faint, underground odor of the banknotes. Each tire became a vault in itself, weighted down with millions of reais before being resealed and pressurized, appearing perfectly normal to any passing observer. As the car carrier truck began its long trek south toward the state of Minas Gerais, the distance ahead of them was staggering. Over 2,000 kilometers of winding highways, police checkpoints, and varying terrain. The driver, a man named José Charles Mores, kept his eyes on the road as the truck groaned under the weight of the 11 vehicles. The plan was to reach the industrial heart of the country, where the money could be distributed and laundered more easily. but the paper trail from the dealership was already moving faster than the truck. Federal agents were communicating across state lines, piecing together the suspicious purchase in Fortaleza and tracing the carrier's route through the dry landscapes of the northeast into the rolling hills of the southeast. It was in the state of Minas Gerais, near the town of Sete Lagoas, that the net finally began to tighten. The air in this region is often thick with the scent of red dust and eucalyptus, a peaceful setting for what was about to become a pivotal moment in the investigation. The federal police, acting on the tip regarding the bulk car purchase, spotted the carrier truck lumbering along the highway. They didn't rush in with sirens blaring initially. They watched and waited for the right moment to intercept. When the flashing lights finally mirrored against the polished paint of the new cars, the atmosphere turned electric. The driver was signaled to pull over into a dusty roadside way station, the sound of the air brakes hissing like a warning as the massive machine came to a halt. The search began with a deceptive quietness. Agents walked around the truck, checking paperwork and inspecting the vehicles. At first glance, everything seemed in order. But as they began to examine the wheels of the brand new Chevrolet Astras, they noticed something unusual. The tires sat slightly differently on the rims, and the weight distribution seemed off. Using knives and heavy-duty cutters, they sliced into the thick rubber. The first cut released more than just air. It revealed a glimpse of light green and gold paper. As the rubber was peeled back, stacks of 50 real notes tumbled out onto the asphalt. It was a surreal sight, 6 million reais, hidden inside the very wheels that were meant to carry the thieves to freedom. The musty smell of the tunnel, which had lingered on the notes despite the long journey, rose up to greet the officers, confirming that they had found the first significant portion of the stolen fortune. With the arrest of Jose Charles Mores and the recovery of those first 6 million reais, the trail was no longer cold. The police had proven that the gang was moving south, and that they were using the country's vast highway network as their escape route. But this was only a fraction of the 164 million that had been taken. While the agents in Minas Gerais were busy counting the dust-covered bills, other members of the gang were still out there, scattered across different states, carrying suitcases and driving other vehicles, each hoping that their own hiding place was more clever than the tires of a car carrier. The hunt was expanding, turning into a nationwide game of shadows that would lead into the darkest corners of the Brazilian underworld. The weight of the money was not just in the heavy, woven plastic bags that the men carried through the damp air of the tunnel. It was a weight that settled into their bones, a heavy, cold pressure that followed them long after they surfaced from the earth of Fortaleza. For a few brief weeks, they felt like the masters of their own destiny. They had executed a plan that most men would only dream of in the darkest corners of their imagination. But as the initial rush of the heist began to cool, replaced by the damp, gray reality of being a fugitive, the realization set in. They had not just stolen 3.5 tons of paper currency. They had painted a target on their backs that glowed with a blinding, irresistible light. The shadows of the underworld were shifting, and the predators were no longer just the federal police. They were the very people these men once called allies, and worse, the very people sworn to uphold the law. Among the group, Luis Ribeiro de Souza occupied a position of both power and immense peril. He was a man who understood the mechanics of greed better than most, having helped finance the operation that pierced the vault of the central bank. In the days following the robbery, while the police were busy dusting the house on Rua 25 de Marco for fingerprints, Luis had retreated into the sprawling, chaotic heart of São Paulo. He thought he could vanish into the city's pulsing rhythm, a needle in a haystack made of 20 million souls. But the money spoke a language of its own. It crinkled in the hands of those who spent it too quickly. It whispered through the bars and the backrooms of the city's underworld. Every 50 real note that surfaced was a breadcrumb leading back to the source. And while the police followed the trail with systematic patience, Other, more violent eyes were watching with a much more urgent hunger. Imagine the scene in October of 2005. The air in Sao Paulo is thick with the scent of exhaust and the sound of distant sirens. Louis is moving through the city, perhaps feeling a false sense of security in his anonymity. He is a man with millions at his fingertips, yet he is more vulnerable than the poorest beggar on the street, because he cannot call for help. He is a ghost in the eyes of the law, a man whose very existence is tied to a crime that shocked a nation. When the black cars pulled up beside him, and the doors swung open with a heavy, metallic thud, there was no crowd to intervene. There were only the strong arms of men who knew exactly who he was and exactly what he had hidden away. They did not want justice. They wanted a piece of the 164 million reais that had vanished into the earth of Sirá. The kidnapping of Louis was a masterclass in the irony of the criminal life. He was taken not by the state, but by a predatory alliance that many believe included both rival gang members and rogue, corrupt police officers. These were men who had seen the headlines and done the math. They knew the thieves could not report a kidnapping. They knew the families would have the cash on hand to pay. For Louis, the world shrunk down to the size of a dark room and the cold touch of steel. The ransom demand was astronomical, 2 million reais. It was a fortune to most, but to the men of the central bank heist, it was merely the price of a life. His family, terrified and desperate, moved with the quiet efficiency that the situation demanded. They gathered the notes, the same used, non-sequential bills that had been carried through the tunnel, and delivered them into the hands of the captors. They did everything right. They paid the price of greed, hoping it would buy back a father, a brother, a friend. But in the world of shadows, there is no honor among thieves, and certainly no mercy among those who hunt them. The exchange was a lie. Days later, in the quiet, rural landscape of Camanduquia, in the state of Minas Gerais, the silence of the morning was broken by a grisly discovery. Louis's body was found abandoned on a lonely stretch of road, far from the city lights and the vault he had helped empty. He had been executed, his life extinguished despite the 2 million reais that had been handed over. The message sent to the remaining members of the gang was loud and clear. The money was not a blessing, it was a curse. They were being hunted by sharks who didn't care about the rules of the game. Other members began to disappear as well, kidnapped for ransom or found dead in suspicious circumstances. Even the security guard who had sold them the blueprints, Dulcimer Neves Queiroz, was found dead, his hands tied, a supposed suicide that fooled no one. This was the dark afternoon of the great robbery. The thieves had spent months in the dark, cool earth, dreaming of the sun. But when they finally reached it, they found that the light was too bright and the heat was beginning to burn. The Brazilian federal police were closing in from one side, and the monsters of the underworld were closing in from the other. The thieves were caught in a vice, squeezed between the law and the lawless. Every luxury car they bought, every farm they invested in, was another beacon for the kidnappers and the extortionists. They had become the very thing they once targeted, a source of easy wealth for those willing to take it by force. As we move forward, we will see how the pressure of this constant terror began to break the survivors, turning their dream of a perfect heist into a waking nightmare that would last for decades. Close your eyes now and listen to the rain outside, a far softer sound than the heavy footsteps of those who wait in the dark. Sleep now. You are safe from the shadows. The dust from the tunnel had barely settled before a new kind of darkness began to bloom in Fortaleza. It was 2005, and the air in the city felt heavy, charged with the static of 164 million reais that had vanished into the humid night. But as the federal agents began their meticulous work, dusting for prints and tracing phone cards, a parallel hunt was emerging in the shadows. This was not a hunt for justice, but a hunt for profit, led by those who carried badges and wore the uniform of the state. The line between the law and the lawless began to blur, shimmering like a heat mirage over the pavement of Sirá. In the quiet corridors of the police stations, a different sort of investigation was taking place. It was a clandestine mapping of the thieves' movements, not to arrest them, but to harvest them. The hunters were becoming the predators, and the great heist was about to enter its bloodiest phase. Imagine a dimly lit room where the air is stagnant, and the only sound is the rhythmic ticking of a clock on a stained wall. Here, the names of the suspects were not just leads, they were price tags. Luis Fernando Ribeiro, the man they called Fernandinho, was one of the primary targets. He was young, only 26, and believed to be the financier who had breathed life into the tunneling project. By October of 2005, only 2 months after the vault was breached, Fernandinho found himself in a nightmare he could not buy his way out of. He was intercepted in the outskirts of Sao Paulo, not by a formal task force with a warrant, but by a group of men who knew exactly how much his freedom was worth. They didn't want a confession. They wanted the lion's share of the 3.5 tons of cash he had helped steal. The kidnapping of Fernandinho sent a shiver through the criminal underworld. His family, desperate and terrified, reportedly paid a ransom of 2 million reais. They expected a release, a return to some semblance of life, however fractured. But the shadows of the law are unforgiving. Even after the money changed hands, Fernandinho's body was discovered on a lonely road, bearing the marks of a brutal end. It was a message whispered in blood. The police were no longer just observers of the crime. Some had become participants in its aftermath. The investigation into the bank robbery was now complicated by a series of internal betrayals. Authorities began to realize that their own ranks were infested with officers who were using their positions to extort the very men they were supposed to be putting behind bars. It was a cycle of violence that threatened to swallow the entire case. The rot didn't stop with Fernandinho. In the spring of 2006, the reach of these corrupt cells extended to the family of Antonio Josevan Alves dos Santos, the mastermind known as Alemo. His own brother was snatched from the streets and held captive for 2 agonizing weeks. The kidnappers, later identified as a mix of civil and military police, subjected him to relentless torture, convinced that he knew where the remaining millions were buried. This was the texture of the investigation, not just courtroom drama and forensic science, but the smell of damp basements and the sound of muffled screams. Moises Teixeira da Silva, the genius of the tunnels, later claimed that he had to surrender over 1.5 million reais to corrupt officials just to keep his head above water. The loot from the central bank was acting like a poison, eroding the moral foundations of the city's protectors. As the federal government poured resources into finding the stolen cash, they found themselves fighting a war on 2 fronts. One against the professional thieves who had vanished into the vastness of Brazil, and another against the rotten oranges within their own system. The pursuit of justice became a labyrinth. Evidence was tampered with, suspects disappeared before they could testify, and the money that was recovered often seemed to shrink between the point of seizure and the evidence locker. It made the task of the honest investigators nearly impossible. Every time they closed in on a suspect, they had to wonder if a corrupt colleague had already tipped them off, or worse, if that suspect was already being held in a private cell for ransom. The shadows of the law were growing longer, stretching over the trial and the public's trust. By the time the legal proceedings truly gained momentum, the case was a scarred and battered thing. More than 100 people would eventually be charged, but the narrative of the perfect robbery had been stained by the very people meant to solve it. The heist at the central bank wasn't just a story of a tunnel and a vault anymore. It was a story of a systemic collapse. As you lie there, listening to the soft hum of the world outside, consider the weight of that corruption. The way the glitter of gold can turn even the steeliest resolve into something soft and malleable. The thieves had dreamed of the sun when they were in the dark earth, but they found that even in the light of day, the shadows were waiting. The pursuit continues, but for tonight, We leave the investigators to their weary work and the suspects to their restless sleep. By the time the legal proceedings truly gained momentum, the case was a scarred and battered thing. More than 100 people would eventually be charged, but the focus of the federal investigators began to narrow, like a lens focusing on a single, distant point. They were no longer looking for the small-time laborers or the men who had merely carried bags of cash through the dirt. They were hunting the architects. They were hunting the men the press had begun to call the barons. These were the individuals who had not only planned the heist, but had vanished into the vast expanse of Brazil, with the lion's share of the 164 million reais. The air in the investigation rooms was thick with the scent of old paper and lukewarm coffee as agents pinned photographs to corkboards, tracing the movement of money that seemed to be bleeding into every corner of the country. It was a patient, silent war of attrition. One of the most remarkable chapters of this hunt took place in the small, sun-drenched town of Boa Viagem. It was here that the federal police deployed a tactic that felt more like a slow-burning romance novel than a high-stakes investigation. An undercover agent, using the name Nicodemos, arrived in town with the carefully crafted persona of a lonely, charming outsider looking for love and a place to settle down. He spent 6 months weaving himself into the fabric of the community, attending Sunday lunches and local festivals. His target was a woman related to the man known as Alemo, the purported mastermind. Through quiet conversations over shared meals and the rhythmic swaying of hammocks on warm afternoons, Nicodemos gathered the fragments of a broken secret. He heard whispers of sudden wealth, of family members traveling to distant cities, and of the hidden locations where the leaders were trying to bury their pasts. It was a betrayal of the heart, executed with surgical precision. While Nicodemos worked the social circles of Sira, other agents were following the trail of luxury that the barons could not help but leave behind. The thieves were learning that it is one thing to possess a fortune, but quite another to spend it without drawing the eye of the state. One member of the inner circle made the fatal mistake of purchasing 11 expensive vehicles at a single dealership, paying in cash with stacks of 50-real bills. The sheer weight of the money was a physical giveaway. Investigators tracked these purchases to remote farms in Mato Grosso do Sul and gas stations in the federal district. The barons were attempting to wash the money through the red earth of the countryside, buying up vast tracts of land and heavy machinery. They were trying to become legitimate businessmen, pillars of society built on a foundation of stolen paper. But every deed signed and every engine started was another breadcrumb for the federal agents following behind them in the dust. The hunt for the ultimate prize, Antonio Josevan Alves dos Santos, the man called Alemo, would take nearly 3 years to reach its climax. By early 2008, the police had narrowed his location to the capital city of Brasilia. Alemo had transformed himself. He had grown a thick, dark beard, put on weight, and moved with a quiet, unassuming gait that blended into the crowded streets of the suburbs. He was living in a modest house in Riacho Fundo, a far cry from the mansions his associates had favored. The surveillance was grueling. For 4 months, agents sat in unmarked cars, watching the flick of a curtain or the movement of a shadow. They waited for the one detail that could not be disguised by a change in weight or hair color. On a humid afternoon in February, they followed him to a tire shop in Taguatinga. As he stepped out of a modest truck, the sun caught a specific tattoo on his arm, a mark they had seen in old police files. The arrest was sudden and surprisingly quiet. When the agents moved in, surrounding him at the gas station near the tire shop, Alemo did not reach for a weapon. In fact, he looked almost relieved. He later told the officers that he had spent every night for 3 years waiting for a different kind of visitor. The kidnappers and rival gang members who had been picking off his accomplices one by one. To him, the federal police represented a strange kind of safety from the violent world he had helped create. But the true weight of the heist was found back at his house. In the kitchen, hidden beneath a heavy stove, investigators found a secret floor safe. Inside were 80,000 reais in cash. The bills were damp, covered in a thin layer of gray mold. It was a haunting image. The great wealth of the central bank, once the focus of such intense planning and labor, rotting away in the dark, unusable and forgotten. The capture of the barons signaled the beginning of the end for the legend of the Fortaleza heist. The systematic takedown of Alemão and his closest lieutenants dismantled the myth that one could simply disappear with the spoils of the century. As the leaders were led into the high-security wings of prisons in Paraná and beyond, the vast network they had built began to dissolve. The millions that remained unrecovered were no longer seen as a grand prize, but as a curse that brought only surveillance, betrayal, and eventually, the cold iron of a cell door. The men who had once felt like giants, tunneling through the earth to touch the heart of the nation's wealth, were now just names on a long list of convictions, their voices echoing in the sterile hallways of justice, while the rest of the world began to forget the sound of their names. The capture of the barons signaled the beginning of the end for the legend of the Fortaleza heist. The systematic takedown of Alemão and his closest associates was a victory for the federal police, but as the prison doors clicked shut, a different kind of silence settled over the investigation. It was the silence of an empty vault that should have been overflowing. When the dust finally settled on the floors of the Banco Central in August 2005, the investigators were left staring at a void that could not be filled by mere handcuffs. They were looking for a mountain made of 3.5 tons of paper. To understand the scale of what had vanished, you must imagine the sheer physical mass of 164 million reais. This was not a digital entry on a screen or a series of wire transfers that could be reversed with a keystroke. This was cold, hard currency. It was enough paper to fill several small rooms from floor to ceiling, heavy enough to strain the axles of any vehicle tasked with carrying it. The air in that vault, before the theft, would have smelled of old cotton, metallic ink, and the faint, sweet scent of used banknotes that had passed through thousands of hands across Brazil. The final accounting of the heist remains one of the most sobering chapters in the history of global crime. Despite the massive scale of the manhunt and the dozens of arrests that followed, the vast majority of that mountain simply dissolved into the landscape. The official records tell a frustrating story. Out of the 164 million reais that were hauled through that 80-meter tunnel, only a fraction was ever reclaimed. Early estimates suggested that less than 20% was recovered in the first few years. Even with the auctioning of seized assets and the discovery of hidden stashes, the total amount clawed back by the state struggled to reach 53 million reais. This left over 110 million reais unaccounted for. It was as if a small fortune had been swallowed by the earth itself, much like the tunnel that had birthed the crime. Investigators spent months tracing the path of the 5 containers of 50-real notes. But the trail often grew cold in the humid air of the Brazilian countryside or vanished into the chaotic noise of the informal economy. The first major crack in the financial facade appeared not in a bank, but on the back of a car carrier truck in the state of Minas Gerais. Imagine the scene: a routine stop, the smell of diesel and hot asphalt, and a cargo of 11 brand-new vehicles. To the casual observer, it looked like a standard delivery. But the police had a tip. When they began to dismantle the cars, they didn't find mechanical parts or leather upholstery. They found cash. 6 million reais had been stuffed into the frames and panels of those vehicles. This was the gang's mistake, the classic blunder of the newly rich. One of the members had walked into a dealership and bought all 11 cars at once, paying in full with stacks of used 50-real notes. It was a flashy, desperate move that illustrated the gang's greatest problem. They had too much money to hide and not enough ways to spend it quietly. That 6 million was a victory for the law, but it was also a taunt. It represented only a tiny sliver of the total, a handful of snow taken from the peak of a massive, melting glacier. As the investigation deepened, the authorities realized that the laundering process was far more sophisticated than just buying luxury cars. The money was being filtered through the very veins of small-town commerce. Antonio Josevan Alves dos Santos, the man known as Alemo, was found to have funneled his share into a series of strategic acquisitions. He didn't just hide the money in walls, he bought reality. He purchased gas stations, where the constant flow of cash sales could easily mask the injection of stolen bills. He bought small farms and expansive ranches in his hometown of Boa Viagem, turning the illicit wealth into soil, cattle, and fences. There is a certain irony in it. A man who spent months underground digging through dirt ended up using his spoils to buy the very land he once tunneled beneath. These properties were seized, eventually bringing the recovered total to around 32 million reais through government auctions. But even then, the ledger remained wildly out of balance. The tangible assets, the houses, the motorcycles, even a boat, could never fully account for the millions that had been divided among the 25 primary conspirators. Then there are the theories that move from the ledger into the shadows of corruption. Many investigators and journalists have long suspected that a significant portion of the missing wealth didn't go into businesses or cars, but into pockets. There are persistent rumors that millions were used to pay for silence and protection. In a world where 3.5 tons of cash are moving across state lines, the price of a closed eye or a turned head is high. Some believe that corrupt officials and members of law enforcement took their own tax from the seizures, further thinning the amount that was officially recorded. There are stories of bags of money being dropped in remote areas to pay off kidnappers who were hunting the thieves, and other tales of wealth being smuggled across the borders into neighboring countries, where it was exchanged for different currencies or laundered through international criminal networks. To this day, the thought of 80 million reais sitting in a buried chest or circulating in the untraceable markets of the underground keeps the legend of Fortaleza alive. It is a ghost fortune, a phantom that haunts the dreams of those who believe the treasure is still out there, waiting to be found. Ultimately, the mountain of vanished wealth became a symbol of the heist's enduring success and its ultimate tragedy. While the men were captured and their lives were dismantled by the justice system, the money itself remained largely free. It had been broken down into such small, untraceable pieces that it became part of the atmosphere. It paid for the education of children who never knew where the tuition came from. It bought the bricks for houses in poor neighborhoods, and it likely funded further crimes that the police are still trying to solve today. The accounting is final in the eyes of the bank, a loss written off and covered by insurance. But in the streets of Fortaleza, the story is never truly over. As the sun sets over the coast, one can't help but wonder about the millions that never came back. They are the silent witnesses to a crime of monumental scale, a treasure that was brought into the light only to vanish back into the darkness. The case of the Banco Central is a reminder that, while you can catch the men who dig the holes, you can rarely catch the wind that carries the wealth away. The dust has a way of staying long after the wind has died down. In the city of Fortaleza, the echoes of the 2005 heist did not vanish when the vault was repaired. For months, the phantom house on the street of Barão do Rio Branco remained a site of morbid curiosity. The bright green sign of the landscaping business, known as Grama Sintética, began to fade under the relentless Brazilian sun. The neighborhood, once so quiet, was transformed into a landscape of flashlights and forensic tape. Investigators spent weeks inside that artificial grass shop, tracing the path the thieves had taken. They looked at the hundreds of wooden planks used to shore up the tunnel walls, and they felt the hum of the primitive ventilation system that had kept the air moving while the men worked in the dark. Eventually, the city decided that the tunnel itself was too dangerous to remain as it was. It was filled with layers of heavy concrete, sealing that 75-meter passage forever. The earth swallowed the secret, turning a masterwork of criminal engineering into a solid, unmoving memory beneath the feet of unsuspecting commuters. The legal aftermath was as massive as the heist itself. Over the years, the investigation expanded into a sprawling web that touched every corner of the country. More than 200 federal agents were assigned to the case, following a trail of paper and blood that stretched far beyond the borders of Syria. By the time the dust finally settled in the courtrooms, 133 people had been indicted for their various roles in the crime. The trials were a marathon of testimony, involving nearly 500 witnesses who spoke of mysterious vans, sudden wealth, and the quiet men who had lived among them. The leader of the operation, a man known as Alemo, whose real name was Antonio Josevan Alves dos Santos, eventually faced the full weight of the law. In 2015, he was sentenced to 80 years in prison for money laundering, a sentence that was added to the 35 years he was already serving for the robbery and conspiracy. For many, this was the final period at the end of a long, dark sentence, a signal that the audacity of the crime would be met with an equal measure of justice. Yet the question of the money remains the most enduring mystery of all. Of the 164 million reais that were carried out of that vault, only a small fraction has ever returned to the hands of the government. Estimates suggest that only about 32 million reais, or perhaps 20 to 30% of the total haul, was officially recovered. The rest simply vanished. Some of it was found hidden in the trunks of 11 brand new cars being transported on a carrier truck through the state of Minas Gerais. Other portions were discovered in safe houses, laundered through small businesses, or used to purchase vast tracts of land and gas stations. But the majority of that 3.5 tons of cash seemed to melt away into the informal economy of South America. It became a ghost currency, fueling other crimes, and perhaps even lining the pockets of those meant to stop them. To this day, the sight of a 50 real note in Fortaleza can sometimes trigger a memory of that weekend in August, a reminder of the wealth that was pulled from the earth and then scattered to the four winds. The impact of the heist reached deep into the heart of the Brazilian financial system. The Banco Central branch in Fortaleza was not just a bank. It was a fortress that had been proven vulnerable by little more than shovels and patience. In the years following 2005, banking security across the nation underwent a radical transformation. The era of relying solely on thick concrete and iron bars ended. New protocols were established, involving advanced seismic sensors that can detect the smallest vibration in the soil, and motion detectors that monitor the silent spaces beneath the vaults. The robbery forced the industry to realize that a threat could come from any direction, even from the very ground they were built upon. The story itself became a piece of cultural lore, inspiring books and a major documentary series titled 3 Tons, which brought the intricate details of the tunnel back to the public eye in 2022. It remains a case study for security experts, and a source of fascination for those who wonder how a group of men could move 3.5 tons of paper through the mud without anyone noticing a thing. But beneath the legend of the perfect crime lies a much darker reality. The success of the heist brought a curse upon those who participated. The tragedy of the vanished wealth was mirrored by the violence that followed the thieves. Many of the men who emerged from that tunnel with bags of cash found themselves hunted, not just by the police, but by other criminal factions. There were kidnappings, extortions, and assassinations. The most notable was the fate of Luis Fernando Ribeiro, believed to be the financier and mastermind of the operation. Despite his family paying a ransom of 2 million reais, his body was found discarded in a rural area, riddled with bullets. The money had brought them power for a moment, but it ultimately brought them to their graves. The brilliance of the engineering and the precision of the planning could not protect them from the greed that the stolen fortune ignited. It serves as a somber reflection on the true cost of such an endeavor. The silence of the vault was replaced by the silence of the cemetery for many of the men who had once stood inside it. Now, 20 years later, the streets of Fortaleza are calm. The traffic moves over the spot where the tunnel once ran, and the Banco Central continues its work, though with much more vigilance than before. The heist has passed from the news cycles into the realm of history, a story we tell to marvel at human ingenuity and to shudder at human folly. The mountain of cash is gone, the tunnel is filled with stone, and the men are either behind bars or lost to the shadows. We are left with the lessons of the dust, the realization that even the strongest walls have weaknesses, and that every great secret eventually comes to light. As we finish our journey through this labyrinth of earth and air, we find that the mystery has finally found its rest. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.